Act 1, Scene 3 is one of the scenes that people remember best in Macbeth. It's the first time we meet Banquo, it's the first time we meet Macbeth. And it is probably the biggest impact of the witches, certainly in the first half of the play. And of course it has two sides to it, two halves to it. The first half is when Macbeth and Banquo meet the witches, but the second half is Macbeth being presented with the title of the Thane of Cawdor, as we saw him awarded in the last scene. And therefore his reaction to that and how he uses that as essentially confirmation bias, a confirmation of what he wants to hear and what he wants to understand after meeting the witches. And of course this is a structural thing from Shakespeare, to place those two things immediately next to each other, Macbeth's prophecies, or the prophecies to Macbeth, directly alongside the apparent fulfilling of part of those prophecies, which leads him to think about the rest. This is also a scene that directly compares with Act 4, Scene 1, the third time the witches appear. It follows almost identical structures in what happens with the witches first, Macbeth entering. After that, the witches perform, giving him three prophecies, the first one of which isn't really a prophecy. Then something about Banquo and his children coming afterwards. Then the witches disappearing, and then Macbeth receiving news that apparently confirms one of the prophecies that he's been given before he decides he needs to do something about this. So do always think about these two scenes, Act 1, Scene 3 and Act 4, Scene 1, in comparison. This is a summary of the events, the witches gathering on the moor. Don't forget this opening bit. It's quite interesting. It's strange, but it's interesting, where they discuss tormenting a sailor in punishment for his wife's refusal to give them chestnuts. If nothing else, that points out that the witches are petty. It's quite a petty thing. I want some chestnuts. No, right, I'm going to take revenge on your by torturing your husband then. It also shows their limitations. They can only torment people in the same way that they torment Macbeth later. Then, of course, Macbeth and Banquo arrive. Important that Macbeth really doesn't get to say anything, particularly before the witches have arrived, so we don't really get to meet him as a character first. Then, of course, we get them hailing Macbeth as Thane of Glamis, then as Thane of Cawdor, and then finally as king, and prophesying that Banquo's children become kings. Macbeth demands to know more, but they vanish. Then Ross arrives again, with Angus alongside him this time, to tell Macbeth that he's got the title of Thane of Cawdor from Duncan. And then he has initial thoughts of becoming king through murder, but the idea is repulsive to him. However, he does have them. Taking on the 7 big issues that I identify in Shakespeare, Macbeth, I will focus in on these 3 here. Macbeth obviously is at the heart of this. Our first meeting of him and our judgment of him in comparison to how he's been described to us before. The supernatural itself, because of the behaviour of the witches here and the influence they have on him, and the way that they're seen as well. And ambition and loyalty, because we see how quickly Macbeth's loyalty that we saw in the last scene changes through his ambition. Okay, so the first key moment I'd take for you comes after the prophecies have been given. It begins with Macbeth ordering the witches around with a great deal of ordering, imperatives: stay, tell me, say, speak. This is the way he speaks to lesser people. You don't get this way of speaking from Duncan towards the captain just now. And in fact, we pretty much have insults here. I mean, he calls them immediately imperfect speakers. Like, what's the need to address them that way? But he does. Okay. At the same time, as well as showing his power and position, don't forget that what he says to them shows his interest in what's going on. But then, once they've gone, we get a good idea of Banquo. They've disappeared. Macbeth's comment is, would they had stayed? I wish they had stayed. Okay? Showing again Macbeth's desire to find out more and how quickly and easily he wants to believe them, wants to take information from them. Whereas Banquo, instead, is questioning it. He's not saying it didn't happen. He's just saying, did this really happen? Were such things here as we do speak about? Or have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner? You know, have we eaten something that's just started to make us hallucinate, I suppose? Okay? So he's much more questioning already, where Macbeth is more about the idea of, I wish they'd stayed with us. Brief key moment, but it is important that Macbeth's response to the witches tells us something about him, okay? And who he is, and we need to get that idea together. Banquo and Macbeth's responses are different, and it's, again, something we need to focus in on to see that even in a subtle way they're being established as quite different. Okay, so quickly on to moment 2. This is once he's been told he's Thane of Cawdor, Macbeth. It's a short little bit, but it's again vital in terms of what we see about the two. First of all, Macbeth responds, once he's confirmed this, once he's said, hang on, how is this true? And it's been confirmed to him, he immediately follows up with an aside, a version of a soliloquy, speaking his thoughts to the side. And he immediately goes with the idea of kingship. Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, right, I'm going to get the rest, the greatest one is coming behind, is following behind. Okay? So here comes the king. I am going to be king. Okay? So again, the ambition is clear. The ease with which he believes this is clear. And it also might be worth noting that once again he uses the triplet idea of Glamis, Cawdor and king, with king being referred to in more vague terms, the same as the witches have just done. But then compare this with Banquo a little bit later on. A very important speech of his when Macbeth says, do not hope that you'll get the same as me. Banquo first of all responds with the idea, well, yeah, absolutely, that might make you king as well. But then comes the warning. It's strange. And oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles to betray us in deepest consequence. Now consider what he's saying there, because basically he's got it straight away. That's exactly what the witches are doing. Winning them over to their own harm, particularly Macbeth here, by telling them truths, honest little trifles, lesser important things, so that later on they can betray them in the consequence of them following on. So Banquo gets it straight away, but he also shows at the same time, just like in the first key moment, he shows a willingness to kind of challenge the ideas, to be sceptical about things. Compare that to the greatest is behind. It's coming. Well, maybe it is, but maybe this is a trick. Maybe this is equivocation, that key theme in the play. So, again, think about the difference in their reaction to that delivery of the news that Macbeth is Thane of Cawdor. Don't think that Banquo doesn't believe it. He does, to a degree at least. And he's certainly interested. Never think that. But he's sceptical. And Macbeth isn't, apparently. Now, the third key moment is probably the most important in this scene and the most likely to be used as an extract in a GCSE question. Structurally, what you have here is you have Macbeth's aside. So essentially a soliloquy while others are on stage. Macbeth going through his thoughts, in which he starts this debate about whether or not he should kill the king. But that's interjected with Banquo talking about how Macbeth is reacting and completely misinterpreting it and seeing it as his attempt to come to terms with things. Or is he misinterpreting it? You know, remember this is a play. With the asides, we know that that's what Macbeth is thinking. So we know it's what's in his head. But when somebody speaks out loud, we don't have to trust them. Is Banquo really believing that he's wrapped in thoughts? He's not quite used to the idea of getting a new honour? Or are his suspicions already slightly there? And is he protecting his friend? There's lots of ways you can look at this. Macbeth's bit revolves around this short line here. Because once again we have a paradox. Fair is foul, foul is fair. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. We've had these paradoxes that will continue through the play that are associated with the witches and their idea. And this is what he comes to here. What I've just heard can't be bad and it can't be good. The reason he takes the idea that it can't be good, it can't be bad obviously, because it's good for him that he gets somewhere. But the reason it can't be a good thing, first of all tells us that within his head he's already aware that the thoughts he's having are not good. He doesn't want them. Okay? It can't be good because it's making me feel and think this way. And again, there's a lot of euphemism here. That suggestion. He's not talking about what it actually is, but we can work it out for ourselves. Essentially, he's clearly thinking of murder and he's yielding to it. He's giving way to it. It's as though the suggestion's coming into his head from the witches, or is it just his personality, his ambition? But he describes it as unfixing his hair, making his hair stand on end, making his seated heart knock at his ribs against the use of nature. His heart is pounding unnaturally. When we look at those two ideas, you see that he is saying it's unnatural and he's having a physical reaction to it, but it's still there. He carries this on by saying this thought, which is just a fantasy, although he does use the word murder at this point, is so shaking his state of manhood that his function is smothered in surmise. His function, his actions are smothered in surmise, his thoughts. He feels unable to act because his thoughts have taken over him, and nothing is except what it's not. Again, things being turned around for him, but it's the physical reaction that is happening to him here that he is focusing on. Now, he does call it a horrid image. It does suggest that at this point he doesn't want this to happen, that this seems horrific, but it is coming into his head, and that's the paradox we have to pay attention to. It does carry on, and it is important to note that he then comes round to saying, well, yeah, but if chance is going to make me king, from what they've just told me, well, then maybe it will crown me without me doing anything, without my stir. That point that a lot of people make. Well, if they said you're going to be king, why not just wait and let it happen? So he does give the other side. And then his conclusion at the end is, come what come may, time in the hour runs through the roughest day. Or come what come may. What we've now changed to come what may. Well, whatever happens. Whatever happens. So he's not come to a conclusion. Whatever happens, time will carry on. Even through the roughest day, time will keep moving. A nice little link there to later on in the Tomorrow speech, where he talks about time going on and on and on and on until the last syllable of recorded time. But in this case, think about what he's suggesting. Whichever way I go, whatever happens, nothing's going to stop time progressing, even through the worst days. Is that a suggestion that if I go through bad stuff, I'll get out the other side? We're trying to think about here, though, is Banquo's reaction as well. And I think that's where we're going to get here. Look at this phrase here. New honours come upon him like our strange garments, cleave not to their mould, but with the aid of use. First of all, do notice it is another example, and there are many, many of them in the play, of clothing motif. Okay, clothing imagery and motif overall of clothing. I suppose clothing being something that, yes, you put on to protect you, to keep you warm, etc., but also that covers up your kind of true self, your kind of naked. It's a covering. It's an overall thing. It's used throughout. And Banquo's using it not to suggest that here. That only comes to us. But he's giving this idea, that when you put on strange clothing, new clothing, whatever, it doesn't quite fit you right until you've used it. Think about shoes. When you first wear shoes and they're a little bit awkward and whatever, and then after you've worn them for a while, they kind of shape themselves around your foot and they feel so much more comfortable. That's the image he seems to be talking about. Once he gets used to this new honour, it'll come closer to him. Now, as I said before here, talking about the idea of an honour as a garment does suggest it's not anything more than dressing up. But it also opens up that idea of, what is Banquo really mistaking what's going on here so much? Is he actually being quite insightful? What we got to think about in this one is this. First of all, why are we given Macbeth's first internal monologues at this moment? It's another structural point. Not just what he says, why now? We haven't heard anything internal from him at all, or from anybody, until this moment. You're Thane of Cawdor. Am I? Yes, you are. Now we go inside his head. Why does Shakespeare make that switch at that point? Say, now I'm letting you inside his head. Now this has happened. And then think, is this positive that Macbeth is there receiving this idea and questioning him, or is he negative? Is it a negative light that he thinks of it at all? Finally, Banquo's apparent misinterpretation. Add that to what we've been thinking about him so far and the portrayal and picture of him that we've had. There's a great argument to think that Banquo is portrayed as almost the, some would say the anti-Macbeth. Others would say it's like who Macbeth could have been. They're both there, they both get prophecies towards things, and they veer off in different directions. And Macbeth goes and does something about it. Banquo just holds out hope. Is this the beginning of their movement away from each other? So, in terms of Macbeth's character, it therefore is important that we understand what impression of Macbeth are we getting. It is our first impression of him as a person, and you do need to consider how that fits in with what we've had so far. With the supernatural, what is Shakespeare doing deliberately to shape our feelings about the supernatural elements? Think about the way this is put together. Think about the way people react. Think about the way the witches spoke and acted. Think about the difference already between Macbeth and Banquo's view. And then back to betrayal and loyalty. Just as we saw in the previous scene, what have we got now? Where are we seeing examples of loyalty? Where has loyalty, as in Macbeth, turned to betrayal? And if we think about the rest of the play, well, the supernatural, it just fits in with the whole idea of the supernatural. How, as the play goes on, are we seeing the same thing? But with Macbeth's character, the direct comparison with the previous scene is important, not just to contrast them, but the idea that Shakespeare has made us feel a particular way, then showed us this Macbeth. With our expectations, has that affected the way we respond to him? And, is this what we see Macbeth as being here? Is this characteristic of how he is across the rest of the play? And then, ambition, loyalty. Again, deliberately, the contrast between what we've just seen with Macbeth, or heard about with Macbeth on the battlefield, his patriotic bravery, and the way he's thinking about betrayal and murder at this point. That deliberate contrast between the two.